Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we have Kathy Lucero with the Clallam County Noxious Weed Control Board giving us a presentation that ties in with the past two that we've had in this horse and livestock series. So this one's going to be specifically on controlling weeds in pasture and hay fields. And the previous two that we have, one was on poisonous plants and the other was on pasture management. And you can find both of those on our website at clallamcd.org. And they are under past workshops under our events section. So if you need to get those, we did send out emails to everyone that was registered for those. But if you didn't get those, feel free to look on our website for those recording links. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kathy. Thank you so much for joining us today. Kathy, are you there?
Oh, how's that?
There we go.
Yay!
All right.
Love technology.
I know, I thought my sound was turned down.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. For those of you who are joining us live, I'm Kathy Lucero with the Noxious Weed Control Program, and I'm going to kind of repeat a few things that I talked about a couple weeks ago about poisonous plants. Some of those things are relevant again. Worth harping on, but I'm going to go deeper, more into the weed control piece, and let's just get started because I've got a lot to talk about, and I realize I need to do that. There we go. So I'm going to talk about, what's the big issue with weeds, and some people feel like, why is any plant considered a weed? And I'm going to review weed control, the elements of it, in a couple of different ways, and you'll see how it works, how I work on that. And then I'm just going to review some common pasture weeds and the different control options, hopefully putting together how a weed control strategy is constructed by looking at a number of different elements. So we'll just get started. So where are these plants from? Why are they weeds? So let's talk about it in a naturally occurring system. There are plants that have been together for a long time. They have natural enemies, natural competition. There are different environmental checks and balances that make it all play pretty nicely together. Sometimes they actually help each other. And we probably wouldn't consider those things weeds until man has a different goal or a different thing we want to do. But those would be like the native plants that might seem weedy. And here's a local example. Horsetail. This is just field horsetail, and I get a lot of questions about this, and my first answer is, well, it is native and it does belong here. It's just doing something you don't like when it's in your garden. So the other kind of group of weeds that are probably more problematic, well, something we deal with a lot, are these plants that come from that gigantuan continent, Eurasia, combining all of those. A lot of the plants have come from somewhere else. That's actually a really critical piece to why they are so problematic for us. So a lot of them were introduced on purpose. For example, when people came here to farm, they often brought their own weed seeds with them. They brought their own seeds with them. And in those seeds were often weed seeds, because the plants that become very, very competitive in an agricultural system, a grazing system, were often to be found in the crops that people were growing. And these often became a lot of the agricultural problems. They brought them with them unintentionally, and because they were adapted to these grazing agricultural systems that we've developed for thousands of years, they throve in those sorts of systems, and we just reproduced it when we came to a new country. And then there are ones that were brought in on purpose as crops or even ornamentals, and then often they behave differently because now they're not with that same complement of plants or environmental conditions often that held them in check and kind of balanced out the system. Now we've brought something in for which there was no balance or competition for. And then there are things that are kind of my purview, are the noxious weeds. And these are the non-native invasives that came in. Hold on, I'm trying to get those things off of there. That were brought in for some reason and are particularly aggressive and really, really difficult to control. And there's actually a very strong weed law that's That's what my job is about implementing that weed law. So let's see, still having technical difficulties. There we go. So what is wrong with weeds? What is a weed? And sometimes the most simple definition is just a plant that's out of place for whatever reason. And it's really important to consider what it is that they're doing that we don't like. And usually they're competing in some fashion for 4 basic things, either for light, they're competing for water, or they suck up all the nutrients. But one that often doesn't really catch our eye until they're not there, or there's too much of them there, is the space that they occupy. And in a pasture or a hayfield, it's really important to have the plants that we want, that we need for our animals, and not the weed. Often does not provide the same sort of nutrition, and it's crowding out those plants. Happens in a natural system as well, where they crowd out the natives that had been happily playing together for thousands of years. So on a more basic level, and maybe where it hits your pocketbook is often something that we pay attention to, they're expensive for us in terms of a number of things. Some of these weeds are toxic, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Some of them just aren't something that animals will eat. And they're not necessarily poisonous, but they won't eat them. And that's a defense system that the plant has evolved to survive. And again, we talked about outcompeting the desirable forage, but they cost money. They cost you productivity. For example, if you have 100 acres of pasture and only 50% of it has palatable forage, then you've lost 50% of your productivity. So sometimes just the quality of it is bad, or the money that it costs you to control them or maintain it in a system that excludes the weeds. So they're expensive, and that matters. So we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Why are these weeds successful? Because they are good at doing what they do. Not because they're evil, not because they're sentient, it feels like it, but they're just doing what works best. The ones that survive are the ones that are going to be adapted to the conditions that they encounter. And humans make a lot of disturbance and adverse conditions. And that's, for example, grazing fields. Boy, we open it up to all sorts of things coming in and making it hard for the things that we want to grow in their place. They're really good at getting around. And often they have a really long-lived seed. Particularly annuals will live a long time waiting for those conditions to come around in which they can thrive. And annuals make a lot of seed. That is their whole strategy, making 1 million seeds. And if only one survives, then they have been evolutionarily successful. So there are just 4 steps to stopping the weeds. And we talked a little bit about knowing what the plant was, how important it was to know the identification of the plant. But really, the most important reason for knowing what that plant is, because we need to know what kind of life cycle it is. That's actually weed control in a nutshell, is interrupting it from reproducing. And you can't do that if you don't know which plant it is. And then the way you do that is deploy a strategy that will limit its access to those 4 resources that we talked about, either light or water or nutrients or the space that it needs to grow. And frankly, not everything is going to work every time. So you have to try it out and see how well it will work for you within the construct of your energy and resources. So again, back to knowing your weed, absolutely critical, because even if you can get it to a plant family, that may not tell you what its life cycle is, and life cycle is the most critical piece. So let's talk about those life cycles and how those play out for us and how they play out for the plant. So you've probably heard all these things, but I'm just going to review it so that we can connect it to the strategy that we would deploy for a particular plant. So an annual is just a plant that has a whole life cycle from when it sprouts to when it makes seeds and dies is 1 year. But interestingly enough, it's not that simple. It doesn't make sense for something to be super simple. There are 2 types that we commonly encounter. There's ones called winter annuals, and those ones actually germinate in the fall. They overwinter, and they're already going to seed by the spring before a lot of things have woken up. They often have a really different germination time than what we'd call spring or summer annuals. And they often take advantage of the fact that a lot of other plants are dormant at that time. A lot of our worst annuals are these winter ones. Now, annuals, their whole purpose in life is to make seeds and reproduce. So they make lots and lots of them. Those seeds can be dormant successfully for a long time, years and years. And often the weediest ones seem to be able to reproduce. They have a shortened annual life cycle. They can do the whole thing in just a few months. And if conditions come around again, they can germinate and do it all over again. So they can make many cycles in just one single year. They're not just takes them a whole year every time. Biennial, biennial is something that takes 2 years to complete that life cycle. I'm going to have to hide that. Hit them. Okay. That whoops, went too far. So biennial is the first year. It makes usually the basal leaves, or rosette we call them, but no flowers. It takes the second year for them to begin making flowers. And then after they've made flowers and seed, they mature and they die. Sounds simple, just keep it from going to seed. However, if it gets interrupted anywhere in that life cycle, it usually has the resources to start over again. And a lot of our worst, or the ones most problematic in our pastures, are these biennials that if they get interrupted, they turn into short-lived perennials and they just try again, just quicker and shorter. So they too have high seed production, a long-lived dormancy, and they can reproduce multiple times a year. And again, all you have to do is keep them from going to seed, and you have that first whole year before they even make flowers that is really the best time to get after them, not late in their season. Some of your options are closing up there. With perennials, again, as it suggests, they live more than 2 years, and it's an indefinite life cycle. And a lot of them spread by seed, but there are ones that can spread vegetatively as well. And they're the simple type. You think of something with a taproot, that would be a simple perennial that maybe dies back every year to the crown, and then it starts up from the crown, or it even keeps its leaves all year round and it just grows a certain time of year. Those are perennials, and a taprooted one's simple. The creeping perennials have multiple ways of vegetatively reproducing, and they're essentially clones of the mother plant. So you can see down here a little picture of, let's see if it does show. So here you see a picture of something that's spreading by rhizomes, what we call rhizomes. They're not actually roots, they're literally underground stems. And then they have more roots besides that. And each of these plants is identical to the parent. And often they can make many, many of them under the ground, and it's very hard to get at that structure. And then there's other kinds like strawberries that spread by stolons, or runners, sometimes we would call them. And they too are identical to the parent. And wherever they touch at a node, kind of between the leaf structures, they can send down roots and start. All of these still can make seed, but they generally tend to count more on this vegetative reproduction. So really, really critical to keep in mind as we go forward how they're reproducing and what are we going to do to stop them from reproducing. So let's just stop and think for a second. Take, for example, which kind of life cycle or weed would dominate in these different situations. Let's take, for example, a field where you're going to plant crops and you till it and you open it up, it's bare ground, and you plant seed into it, versus a pasture that's got good ground cover and maybe, hopefully, not a lot of spaces in it. Which kind of weed do you think will get there first? And the answer is an annual, because annuals are designed to get there first, get there fast, and grow quickly and reproduce and be done before they have any competition. So in the situation where the ground is open, the annual is going to dominate. In a pasture that's got good ground cover, only if there's open spaces will that annual have a chance to dominate. But say, for example, later in the season, what kind of long-term problem are you going to have? And in a cropping system, it's still going to be that annual, because if you're going to till, you will always disturb and disrupt the root systems of the biennial and the perennial. just as they're starting to get started. But the annual might finish its life cycle before you've collected your crop. However, in a pasture, annuals almost never tend to be dominant at all unless you've really got an unhealthy pasture. And that's the easy way to take care of them, is to make sure there's no space for them. However, over time, the perennials and the biennials even will set up a place because there was an empty spot at one point, and they're harder and harder to get rid of because all the plants are perennial or biennial in that system, and they've already got a foothold and they're harder to get rid of. And even further than the pasture, you can see, and this is one of our local beautiful farm, and already they're getting lawn daisy all through in here because they're just as successful as the perennial plants that they wanted. And even worse is an area where you're trying to manage the stocking rate of these animals to not favor the weeds and reduce the amount of healthy good forage that you want. So it's really about that life cycle overall. So an integrated weed management system looks at every option. What are all the options and how would they best be deployed? Remember, we're trying to interrupt reproduction because that's the only way you're going to win. And control is just one part of that cycle. You're monitoring, you're identifying, you're preventing, control, and then you're going back and looking, did it work or didn't work? And everything you do is creating a selective pressure, or in other words, an evolutionary pressure that selects for the weeds that would survive under that type of pressure. I'll give you an example. If you mow your lawn, things that lie flat underneath the lawnmower are going to do better than things that might get controlled by having their growing points up higher. So eventually, the only things you still have in your lawn are the things that grow under the lawnmower when you mow. And that's true of every type of control action. That's why there's never one thing that will always work forever. And something you have to consider if you're a farmer, and you have to consider the costs, and any farmer has to consider weigh their actions. You need to decide whether I can tolerate it, it's really not costing me that much, or if I'm going to do something, is it worth the gain that I'm going to get by controlling that weed? That's an actually really important component. Tolerance is always an option. You just have to decide whether it's important enough to get rid of the weed. So you have to weigh those costs, and you have to choose the best mix that's going to bring you the greatest bang for your buck. And you need to consider what species you're after and what impact is it actually having on you. How bad is it? Is it so overwhelming you don't even want to try, or is it so overwhelming you've got to do something because you're not getting anything off that field anymore? Timing is often really critical, and it goes to that life cycle. And there's also some sensitivity perhaps on the site that you're going to be working. Is it near water? There are a lot of rules about doing things near water. Are you going to cause erosion? You're going to lose your soil. There's all sorts of things like that to consider. Can you actually get to it with the tool you want to use? And are you able to go back, because no weed control is one and done. That just doesn't exist. So if you thought that I could tell you that, you should probably cover your ears or go somewhere else, because it's just not really a thing. So the number one place that you want to be doing the most work is in the planning and the prevention. It's the least expensive cost. It's almost a non-action. You're not actively out there mano a mano with the weeds, but it's probably the most critical and the most effective thing. And just setting your goals. So what do you want to have growing in that pasture? And it differs depending on the animals or the utilization you have for it. If it's cows, you might want something with super high protein that they're out there eating. Some of the horses can't eat such high protein without foundering, or different animals have different needs. And that's actually very individual. You need to decide that for yourself. You need to figure out what weeds you got. Where are they coming from? Can you stop them coming into you? Is it coming in contaminated materials that you're bringing into the farm? Is it coming in the hay that you put out in the winter to feed your animals, and now you've got all this stuff that you've never seen before? There's a big piece about the soil, and the things that we want to grow aren't necessarily things that are happy growing in our native soil conditions. They're not really that great for the most part for the crops that we want to grow. So test, don't guess. find out what your soil conditions are. And the Conservation District is one of my favorite resources for figuring that out. And they use a lab that just gives you the most wonderful, not only explanation of what you've got, but what you can do about it, depending on what your goal is for that land. Always make sure you're buying clean seed and materials, that weed-free hay, all those sorts of things. Be careful what you're bringing to yourself. It's surprising what shows up just because you brought a load of a soil in to fill a hole or something like that. Manure that's from somewhere else. I did that thinking that I could beat those weeds. I had some friends who had a huge bunch of manure and I needed it badly, but they also had a lot of quackgrass, which I did not have. And I thought, well, I will just sort all those roots out as I'm filling up the trailer shovel by shovelful, and I will keep it from coming in. Well, I was quite foolish and very humbled. I never was able to get that back out again and put that genie back in the bottle. So making sure it's clean is super important. And keeping the equipment that you use. Often, a lot of the fields around here have been contaminated by someone who's the only one with a machine that can do the hay, and they go from field to field to field, and one has something in it that they carry to the next field. Even your animals, look at that animal. Those aren't flies, those are seeds all over that cow's face. And often animals can bring things back and forth and drop them off in the most inconvenient places. You just don't want to have bare ground. The nature abhors a vacuum, and any open space is an invitation to a weed, particularly those annuals, but a lot of those very pernicious perennials are just looking for a chance to establish a new site. Once you've gotten weeds out, if you've dug them up or you pulled them or you've tilled and gotten roots out, what are you going to do with those propagating parts? Think hard about where you're going to quarantine those dirty spoils, or are you going to need to bag it up and do something else with it? Are you going to burn those materials? I love burning, but there are certain plants you shouldn't burn because the smoke is toxic. So you need to know those things. And you need to kind of follow up with what works, what doesn't work. So cultural conditions, another really, really, really important piece, and I think Megan kind of touched on a lot of this, about making sure that the underlying soil conditions and choosing the right kind of species for the site that will provide the right kind of competition will do the work for you, in essence. And one really important thing that this picture demonstrates, that's all oxeye daisy. And around here, there didn't used to be a lot of oxeye daisy. And as the fields were not being maintained in the same way that they were, when they got hayed, so they just have somebody come in and hay it just to get it down. They weren't really using it anymore. Often when it's time for haying is right when oxeye daisy seeds are just sitting there ready to be spread around. And that's exactly how a lot of it got around on our local fields. So always harvest before that weed seed forms. Hand removal, there's nothing better than just getting right down to it mano a mano. I love being able to dig them up. It's immediate, it's gratifying. You know you got it. You can be very selective about what you dug up, but it's really only good for small infestations. If it's a lot, Lord, there's just no way you can dig it all up. Actually, what's in this picture here is a bunch of little tansy ragworts. And look at how many bare spaces this ground has. I look at that and go, well, no wonder there's tansy. There's lots of places for those seeds to light. And indeed they did. There was nothing to keep them out. And when they're small or there's just a little bit, sure, you can easily dig them out. There's a lot of different tools that work, but it's only really good for annuals that don't have a really substantial taproot, or that biannual, that especially when you can get it when it's young, it's not gonna really work that well for most of the weedy perennials because they will regrow from pieces of root left, or you didn't get those rhizomes or some of the other propagating parts out. So you want to get as much of the root out as you can and dispose of those or dry them out completely so they can't just grow in place right back again. But hand removal can be a great tool. And Megan and I were talking a little bit about this picture. There's a lot going on here. And one of the wonderful tools at your disposal that most people don't have in their landscape is this grazing, which is in essence biological mowing. And there's actually quite a trick to it. And if you understand how these plants grow and how they're replenishing and surviving for the next year, it can actually go a long ways to making sure that your pasture stays healthy. So I'm just going to touch on this briefly, but just introduce this concept that there's a lot to know about how to deploy your animals to do, your mowing in a proper way that encourages grass to grow and at the same time discourages those weedy broadleaf things that you don't want. So this picture kind of shows where the growing point is. And in a grass, growing point is actually pretty close to the ground when they are, what they call the tillers, which are these stems. Each stem is called a tiller. When they haven't actually started to elongate, when they're just starting to come up. And each one of these tillers has their own little growing point in them. And if you cut them off above this red line, or chew them off if you were a horse or a cow or a grazing animal, you haven't damaged those growing points. And they will go on to regrow, and actually it will encourage more tillering and flush up this growth. If you do this early in the season, when they have lots of storage to help them regrow, there's moisture, it's sunny, it's warm, everything's happy. But if you do it later, when they've already elongated, look how far up the growing point is. It's no longer way down here. And when you graze it down to leave just a little bit there, you've actually removed the growing points, and it has very little ability to grow. The tiller's done. It's finished its life cycle, and it's not going to grow anymore. So you've actually made a fairly spindly plant, and they've lost the ability to recharge their whole system by storing up photosynthesis into their roots. And next year they may look even worse. So that's how overgrazing or grazing too low at the wrong time of year can really have an impact on the health of your grass. Now, broadleaf plants are very different. They only have growing points at the tip and at the tip of the roots, and where there's maybe the secondary growing points, sort of, it's not quite the same, where there's a bud growing in these leaves. So if you cut it low early in the season when it's just emerged, it might have enough resources to start again, which, like a lot of the biennials do, they've stored up and they're determined to come up again. So often they'll regrow. But if you cut them high, they may actually just make multiple stems at that point. So that's when they're in the early stages. They've got lots of storage to draw upon, and they're going to try again. But once they get to the bud stage, they've switched from using their root resources. They've already done a lot of growing, and they're actually trying to produce new sugars that will help them grow, that they're using to grow instead of the storage, or later on they'll be actually storing it. And if you cut them high, there's still quite a bit of material here that they can grow from, and they have some little buds that might become the more dominant one after the top part's removed. But if you cut it low, you may actually kill the plant because it doesn't have any way to create new sugars, and it may have already used up the storage that it had in anticipation of the next growing season. And once you reach the flowering stage, when you cut it high, you've removed all the reproductive stuff that it was going to make seeds with the flowers. And if you cut it low, it may try a little bit because it's had this much sugars to work from, but starting to get harder and harder. And if you cut it when it's dormant, there's just nothing happening at all. So you can fit these into either to your advantage to grow lusher and better grass, and maybe take care of some of the weeds that you don't want in it. And one other point that I was reading about was that grasses, and Megan may be able to correct me, grass can have about 75% of the protein that legumes would have in a forage. And they can be quite nutritious that way, depending on the animal too, if they have extra stomachs and ways to process it, some of those things. But a lot of the weeds have less than 50% of that protein because a lot of them are just stems. It's not high foliage that's really nutritious. They're often really stemmy. And so there's another reason that you're not getting the forage just because they aren't providing it in that kind of and the weedy stems are just not as nutritious as a good grass would be. So what about going back and fixing some of those areas that are starting to get worn out? And I hear lots of people ask, well, should I just renovate the field? Just till it up and replant, and it's like, oh Lord, wow. I used to think, wow, that'd be great. Let's just start over. The problem is, once you open that ground up, you have told all the seeds, they have all the access to light and moisture and everything they want. And they've been lying in the ground waiting for their chance. And you just gave it to them. So you really need to know, does it really need a whole renovation, or are some other less drastic measures appropriate for what's going on? And timing is really important. If you do it in the late summer or the fall, you might get the new thing established really well, and the weeds are sort of fading, and they may not come out nearly as well. Will certainly compete well with weeds that emerge in the spring, because you've already let them get established and occupy and suck up all the nutrients first. But you are, and especially in this area, vulnerable to those cool season weeds that do start to germinate in the fall. Surprisingly, things like poison hemlock, if we get a little bit of rain and around in September, which we generally do, you'll often see a lot of germination happening in the fall, and they go on to being flowering in pretty early in the spring. Instead, maybe you just want to lightly touch up with a harrow and kind of scrape and reseed and make some good soil contact with just a little bit of seed instead of doing this whole renovation. Always make sure that you're using weed-free seed. That totally makes sense. And you'll see on most labels now, they'll say how much weed seed, and in this label it says there's 0. Wow, that's amazing that they have 0 weed seed. They worked really hard to achieve that, and that's what you want. So if you were to want to choose an herbicide, there is a lot to using herbicides, and no one should use them lightly or without being very careful. Just so you know, all pesticides and things that we add to them are registered with the EPA. But in Washington State, we are very, very, very strict. And even if it's been registered with the EPA, it still must pass Washington's registration in order to be allowed to be sold and used in our state. And anytime you use a product, there's going to be limitations on how you use it, with good reason. We want to make sure we're using it wisely, that it works well with doing the least amount of harm as possible, no harm if possible. And that's going to, there's going to be information about how much to use, and if you can use it near water, around people, around animals. Is there a grazing restriction? Where can it be used? Which plants does it work on? And the label is the law. It's a legal document, and you are bound to use it, and you need to read it. And that's a whole nother class that Megan and I have talked about having, just so people were able to read those more easily. When you're using herbicides, you need to consider a selective herbicide. That's usually my preference if it's going to be in a grass field, because you can select to have the herbicide work on broadleaves and not on grasses, and vice versa. You can have it work on grasses and not on broadleaves. But if it's a selective that works on broadleaves, it's probably going to work on the legumes, and sometimes that's a desirable component of your pasture. You need to make sure you know if there's grazing restrictions, and most of the ones that we use don't. That there's so little harm for them, but they're very, very careful. Are you going to slaughter them for meat anytime soon? And there may be restrictions about how close to slaughter, or are you getting a product from them like milk, and how much you might have been able to use on a field that they are foraging on. So that'll all be in the label. If it's something that you do need to have a grazing restriction for whatever reason, do you have cross fencing so that you can exclude the animals and keep them out before you use something like that? And then how soon can you come back and put grass seed down? Even though something might work best on a broadleaf plant, that's only because grass tends to be much more tolerant for a variety of reasons. It's especially designed that way, but baby grass is not as tolerant. Sometimes you need to wait a certain period of time if there's residual, a time period that the herbicide lasts, getting at those seeds that haven't come up yet, and they work on grass seed too. Are there mulch and compost restrictions? Things like if you have an animal that's been eating, that didn't bother them, but the manure or compost that comes from that field still might have some of that herbicide in it, and it might work really well in a place you don't want it to. You need to know if that's something that will happen. So you have to read those labels very, very carefully. And certainly our office is available to help with that. detective work sometimes, it feels like. So if you're an organic farmer, you really need to know the rules about what you can and cannot do. Some things might be considered organic, even though it might not make sense. But where I would just say that where you really have a bad weed infestation, you need to consider, you may never get over that hump with an organic farming method. And you might need to consider doing a chemical control, getting it clean, getting in a good state where you can be organic after that. So before you get your certification, and know the value. Is it worth enough to be organic to the cost, the labor cost, and some of the other costs you'll incur by not being able to use this tool if you really have to? So just throwing that out there. So let me make sure I know where I am. We're doing good. So your pasture and hay field, I think Megan covered it really, really well. You need to know what your animal, what you want on that field. Is it going to be grasses? Is it going to be legumes? Is it going to be a mix? What is it? You need to make sure that they got the proper pH, because most of our agricultural grasses like a fairly neutral pH, and actually our native soils are slightly acidic, and it makes it hard for them to survive. So sometimes you have to manage that fertility. Are you going to be able to irrigate or not? And which mix of forage is going to do well in that situation? Boy, that controlled and rotational grazing is really a very sustainable model once you've got everything going for you at the right time. So after you've had them on, often animals will graze preferentially. The things that don't taste good are the things they don't eat, and they eat all the stuff they do. And the things that don't taste good then go on to reproduce and do very well. So sometimes after you've moved animals off a field, it's good to go through and just level the playing field, cut everybody back to the same size, and it helps grasses compete once again with those broadleaves. And renovate only as needed, but allow those seeds to get that pasture to get established before you put animals on it. So we talked a couple of weeks ago about whether it's poisonous. That's actually a big deal about whether you're going to go after a weed or not. And they're different species, as we talked about, have different things that they're poisonous to. And there are a lot of really wonderful resources to help determine which those things are. So dose is everything. It depends on what kind of animals you're going to have, what species, what gender, how old they are. All those things will make a difference as to whether they're going to feel an effect from a plant that might be out in your field. So I'm going to pause briefly there, but I'm going to plunge on, because I know that sometimes what people really want is just tell me what to do for this specific plant. And so they're really back to those 4 pieces. You have to know the plant, and now you can see that we have to figure out what life cycle it is, so we know which weed control technique to deploy that will be effective to stop it from reproducing. And then you're going to have to contemplate and see if that works. So having said that, I have grouped them starting with an annual, mainly because I'm seeing this one spread a lot. I really haven't seen much in Port Angeles, but it's horrible in Squim, and I'm just astonished. It's just exploded, and it's not palatable. It's not toxic, but animals just won't eat it, and it seems to occupy more and more land out there, and I find that distressing, because I think we're going to lose forage for that very reason. So this is burr chervil. It's also probably our biggest and closest thing that looks like hemlock. So people confuse this a lot. So it's an annual. All you have to do is keep it from going to seed, right? It sounds easy, but it's not, because it makes a lot of seeds. But let's just briefly touch on the identification. It has little hairs. They're really tiny. If you hold a leaf up to the light, you'll see these little hairs. But right here is a really easy place to see where a leaf stem meets the main stem, this axil, and there's often a fringe of hairs, but it have hairs all over the place. And that's a key feature to identify it from a number of the other plants. It's not palatable, it's not toxic, but it's called burr chervil for a reason. Those seeds stick to everything, your animals, your equipment, materials that are being taken off. And I'm pretty sure that's how it's getting spread, because nobody's really paying attention to it. So for control, you need to watch that it's come in. Are you starting to see this little plant show up? It's still pretty short right now, but it starts up pretty early. And if you limit bare ground in places that it's very competitive, it will help a lot. That's the prevention piece. Don't let it get going. You could pull or dig up or scrape away early infestations, but it spreads so rapidly, and you might consider a chemical option. Pretty much anything will kill it early. The longer you wait with an annual, the less herbicides work at all. They are almost finished with their life cycle, and most herbicides that work on these annuals and the selective ones for broadleaves, they're working to regulate the growth. And if the plant has finished everything it needs to do to make seeds, the herbicide no longer works. So any kind of herbicide control on an annual has to occur as early as it's growing quickly. And that's tricky here. We had a really cold spring, and the plants were sort of growing, but not really fast. And it was hard to get something on that would have an impact. So it can be tricky with our weather to get on something early enough with the right temperature to make it work, and the right time of their life cycle. So mowing is pretty ineffective. It just gets really short and still seems to do its thing, and those seeds. So the next one I want to talk about, poison hemlock. We talked about it quite a bit, and you can see this giant taproot. That's a plant that has been mowed and mowed and mowed. And this is typically considered a biennial. Normally, if it starts the first year with kind of a rosette of parsley looking like leaves, and then the next year can get 10 feet tall in just 1 year. But if you mow it, it's not done yet, and it will continue to draw on those root resources, and it will come back time after time, shorter, faster, trying to finish its life cycle. So again, the key ID thing is, remember that other one had hairs here. This has no hairs, and it's very, very smooth, the whole thing. And it is poisonous, whether it's green or whether it's dry. And all parts are poisonous. So control, these dig up really well. They're just like a big carrot. And if you just have a few, boy, digging is the way to go. But if they're already getting older, you need to make sure you remove all the seed heads, because I swear these things last 10 or 15 years. The one that's still waiting for its chance, and you think they're all gone, and they're still coming back. You cannot compost these things, and you shouldn't burn it, because this smoke of this plant is still toxic. And you got to do it over and over again. It seems like it'll germinate all spring, and again in the fall. In just when you're not looking, it's back. So it's one that's tricky. All you do is keep it from going to seed. However, those seeds, if it's done at once, there are a lot of seeds in the seed bank. So mowing's not effective. It just makes more of them happen faster. Selective herbicide can work for a large site. And if there's just a ton of seedlings, you just can't dig them all up. It may be the way to go, and can be very, very effective to getting it down to where there's just one plant that you could dig up. Wild chervil is not one that we have. We've had maybe a couple show up in the county over towards Squim, but it's mainly something that's in Jefferson County. However, it certainly spreads by seed, and I worry about equipment being used between, say, WSDOT, mowing, and getting some stuff in their equipment, and then their shops extend across county borders. So it's very possible that we would get it and move it all around. So far, so good. But again, another biennial, and you're going to start to see some of the control measures start to make sense, because the measures for annuals, the measures for biennials, and the measures for perennials can differ. Hold on, let me get this off. Whoops, there we go. So it's, whoops, go back up, please. So here, remember we saw a lot of hairs here with the burr chervil, no hairs for the poison hemlock. But look at these kind of ridges on it. It almost looks celery-like, and it does have hairs. Unfortunately, it has leaves very, very similar to poison hemlock, but these hairs and these ridges are part of the key ID pieces. And it's not that it's poisonous, but if it does get into hay, it's so full of water that it often causes the hay to mold and ruins it. And I don't think it's very palatable as well. So again, pasture management, really, really important. Don't leave bare spaces. Encourage those grasses to do well. Avoid bare spots. You can dig them up when they're young, but this one makes quite a root, and it does seem to sprout very, very well from its roots. Poison hemlock, a little less so. This one, a little more so. They're all a little bit different. Make sure you don't ever let it go to seed, and don't put those things in the compost. Put them in the garbage. And you could consider selective herbicide for a big infestation. Again, mowing doesn't work. Why? Because they just come back and try again, or you haven't stopped them from going to seed. So here's the wild chervil leaf, and it's actually kind of similar to poison hemlock. So wild chervil up here, poison hemlock here. You can see the little bits of hair. This one has no hair, just for comparison. And one more carrot. There are so many non-native carrots that are problematic. So this is wild carrot, which is also called Queen Anne's lace. It is the forerunner of our domestic carrot, and it is not native here. Carrots were not from here, but they do grow really well here. And one of the characteristics, it gets this kind of like a bird's nest, they call it seed head. And man, it makes a lot of seed. And underneath, I might have to go back up and see if I have a picture. See in this poison hemlock picture, these little leaf structures are called bracts, and they're very, very short in poison hemlock. But in wild carrot, they're actually long and almost decorative. And there are actually a number of ornamental wild carrots, Queen Anne's lace, they're making now that I don't think are as prolific, but I don't know, I've just seen them in the nursery. So these ones, even when they're dry, these stems are super rough, kind of like someone's unshaved leg. They're kind of bristling, and they're very clearly different. And there's just a long stalk, no leaves, and then this lovely flower head. Not palatable, they don't like to eat it. Who eats the greens of carrots, right? They eat the roots. So the greens aren't very tasty. Animals don't really like them. And I've heard that animals that eat them can cause the milk to taste a little odd, and too much of it can be mildly toxic or stomach upsetting. So again, it's a sign. This one in particular is a sign that the pasture isn't healthy. And it's one that seems to happen when pastures are kind of let go and nobody's caring for them in the routine way that you need to do. You might consider, do I care? Is it that big a deal? Could I just tolerate it? That is a consideration. You can pull or dig early infestations early on. They come up pretty well. You just got to get a hold of those seeds. You cannot be mowing those, and they're already, they're not flowering yet, but they would be in time of haying, and you would be spreading those seeds all around and making it worse. So if you move to another pasture that's a little bit ill health, you're going to spread this thing into it. There are chemical options for large infestations, but again, mowing doesn't do a darn thing for almost any of these. So let's move on to a non-carrot, but another biennial. And we've talked about tansy ragwort, and I show this picture of the roots because what happens if you mow, they have something called an adventitious root, and it just grows sideways, more stems come up, and more roots come out. Every time you mow it, you tell it to take a little U-turn there and make it worse. So the first year, it has this little rosette on the ground. That's the time to get any biennial, before it's ever made seed, when it's young. Then the second year, it grows tall and it makes all these flowering heads. After a while, they form seeds, and this is in the composite family. So what we call petals here, these are ray petals and these are disc petals. Each one of these is actually a complete flower, and they make a single seed. And these, the flowers here, they form something like a pappus that looks like a little parachute, and when it blows, it flies away. You think of dandelion seeds are a classic. They blow around, go far and wide looking for an open space. But the ones in the disc, they don't form those pappus. They fall near the parent. Any place that's open, disturbed, think of hooves in the winter in our soils when they're wet, trampling that ground and making big holes in it. That's where the tansy ragwort's going to find a really happy home. So pasture management is essential. The stronger that grass is, the better cover, the less likely tansy will ever get a foothold. Always look for the rosettes. It's easy to see the flowering ones and pull and bag those flower heads, but it's the rosettes that are next year's plants that you're getting ahead of. And you can consider a selective herbicide for the large infestations, but you have to do it before they bolt, because after that, they've got everything they need to do to go to seed, and they will do it regardless of any herbicide that you apply. Mowing doesn't work. However, in combination, where sometimes it's just too cold to treat some of these biennials, it's just not going to work. If you mow it knowing that it's going to resprout, and you come back, say in a couple of months when it's nice and warm and it's just really growing rapidly, you actually can give it a real whammy. And sometimes that's the best way to get a chemical control by using mowing to reset its biological clock. There are some biological agents, we call them, and that would be insects that have been used on these. Some people think of the cinnabar moth, and they start as this larva that's kind of orange and black striped. They're kind of beautiful, but unfortunately, they were introduced very early on, and they hadn't tested for all the native senecio species that we do want, and they eat everybody. And they don't tend to work very well here because in the fall, we start to get a little bit of moisture, and the defoliation that's occurred, the tansy ragwort, because it's a biennial, this comes right back just as well and still goes to seed. So it's all for naught. There are a couple of that work a little bit, but it's not really timed correctly for this area. Mustards, I mentioned these because, again, I'm seeing this spread like wildfire, and there's a lot of it in squim. Squim and brassicas are, boy, it's like the happy place for them to go. But I'm seeing it come into Port Angeles either through contamination or whatever, but they're starting to get into these fields that aren't being not a good enough cover. So again, it's supposed there are many different kinds. Some are just annuals, like this shepherd's purse. Many of them are biennials, but so you have to control the seeds and that darn taproot. And I swear, if you mow over these mustards thinking you're going to get it, it turns into a rutabaga down there. It's this giant turnip-like structure that is not going to go away, and it will continue to resprout over and over again. And these have a variety of poisons that can occur if animals eat too many of them. So watch for that contamination. The first time you see it show up on the manure pile or in the compost pile, get rid of it. You just pull it out of the ground. It's easy. Limit that bare ground, because that's often how it's getting established. You can pull and dig. It's very satisfying to pull those out of the ground when it's wet. You can use a selective herbicide for large infestations, but you have to do it really early because these things form seeds very, very early in the season. And mowing, pretty ineffective. And most animals don't really like to eat it. I'm going to introduce another one that I didn't talk about, I don't think last time, was common teasel. And I'm introducing it because I'm seeing a distressing amount of it arise. We listed it as a noxious weed, a regulated one that needs to be controlled, because we thought it was just in the early stages of infestation. And in the last 5 years, it's just exploded because the seeds can float in the water and travel long distances. So this tends to be in some place a moist meadow. Of course, we don't have any of those around. And it's incredibly prickly. It has these lovely decorative heads. I'm sure you've seen silver or gold ones or in flower arrangements. And this is just like a salt shaker full of seeds. And once they have bolted and made this shape, they can sit there raining seeds down on the ground for years to come. And that's exactly what we finally figured out, why they're so hard to control. They start out as these bumpy, odd looking things, and they're already prickly. They've got a prickly underside to them along this rib. And then when they get tall, the stems are nasty, prickly, and they form these impenetrable thickets that nothing will go in. And they have completely overwhelmed and kept your pasture from being at all useful to you in very little time. So be alert. The first time you see one of these heads, it means you've had a 2-year plant already and they've made seeds. So you're gonna have to watch for them. But if you get that seed on off, make sure you remove that seed head and start looking for these little rosettes in the ground. They're kind of inconspicuous at first. They definitely hide in under the grass. But if you wait too long, when they're older, they're harder to pull. They are more resistant or tolerant of herbicide, and they're a lot harder to get rid of. Mowing, absolutely, just like all the other biennials, doesn't do anything unless you're resetting that clock like we talked about before. So bull thistle is I think it's the last one I'm going to talk about in the annual side of things. And I'm sure you've all seen this, but I wanted to talk about this one because it is not Canada thistle, which is the one that is really, really problematic. The way you tell it, it's got this really large purple, but the head is super spiny. And here's the young plant that you didn't know that was going to turn into the 6-foot multi-armed monster later on, just the next year. So when it's like this, you just kick them out of the ground. Got to get some of that taproot. So it's in the composite family. Again, all of these are going to form that little flyaway, look for an empty space. So if you look at this picture here, You see clumps of bull thistles all over the ground, but look at how open it is. It's literally inviting it to come in, and they are able to deal with really harsh, crappy soil. So it's looking for that disturbed ground. If you prevent that with good ground cover, improve the desirable species that you want, you really won't have any bull thistle problem. It will never be bad. And you could always pull those rosettes. They're pretty easy to get out. And you only need to spray. It's really rare that you need to spray bull thistle. And it certainly cannot be sprayed at this stage. You got to hit these early. Mowing doesn't work. So you're probably seeing a little pattern here. I do want to mention, we have a wonderful native that you rarely see. It usually comes up in forested areas that have been logged over. It shows up, makes some seed, then it disappears. And everybody loves to eat it. It's soft and cobwebby. Here's its first-year plant. And here's the bull thistle. They grow in identical locations because they're both biennials. It's both looking for the same thing. But the native one has a super soft, cobwebby, hairy, they're actually kind of cool, and they can get quite tall. Just wanted you to know that there's one you don't have to worry about, but they can obviously grow right together. That's because the bull thistle, a little more aggressive, showed up, and the edible thistle showed up and probably lost out to the bull thistle. And we're starting now on the perennials. So we've moved from biennials into perennials, but we're going to start with some taprooted perennials. And I'm pretty certain just about everybody that might be listening or watches this will have this plant somewhere in their field because we have just the right soil for it. But it is not a dandelion. It looks like a dandelion. They're similar. They have the same kind of leaves, sort of, and they have the same little yellow daisy head, but they're really very, very different. I think we talked about cat's ear in the poisonous class, and these leaves are very bitter, not palatable, and they can cause laminitis, and they lie really, really flat on the ground. If you dig one of these up, there'll be a bare spot where this has. Dandelions have more upright leaves. They're full of nutrition, full of good things, and they don't do the same sort of competition that the cat's ear does. However, cat's ear are really, really tolerant of our dry conditions in the summer. It's the last green thing in the lawn when you're not watering. There's that cat's ear, still green as can be, sending up new shoots. And it really likes that terrible heavy clay soil. And if you, like a dandelion, if you were to try and dig these up, which I've done many, many times, if it's really young and really moist, I might get the whole root, but any piece that you leave, that actually has the ability to start a new plant from a tiny piece of the root that's still down there. So what to do about them? Well, you're going to have to deal with the soil conditions. That's partly why they're so successful there. And the pasture just isn't that healthy. There have to be openings in that place. And you have to decide, do I really want to go to all the effort to get rid of them? They're very common. They really like it here. It's hard to keep them out. It's hard to keep the field in a good enough condition to keep them out. You can dig them when they're really young, or just a few of them. And you could consider a selective herbicide if you have a really heavy infestation. Mowing doesn't work. And I'm going to mention oxeye daisy because I almost don't even see this thing anymore. It's so bad around here. This is a really terrible picture of Happy Valley. Sorry, it was a slide and then it was scanned. Very, very bitter. Not something that animals will eat at all. So it's certainly an occupier of space that crowds out the plants that could be there. And it loves our native soil. So again, when that pasture is starting to lose the fertility necessary for our agricultural growing conditions, oxeye daisy inevitably moves in, and it does really well. And again, our harvesting systems are timed just correctly when this plant is in full seed, and we move it around with every hay bale or the machinery. So it's telling you something about your soil, that it's not in good shape, that you have poor fertility. So you could just tolerate it. If it's not a big deal, you got plenty of land, what the heck? Your animals are not going to eat it, and it will spread. And it's got this crown that usually the inner part of the crown starts to die back, and it just kind of keeps creeping out. They call it a rhizomatous, but I don't truly think it is. So it's kind of in between. It's a perennial that does creep outwards and continues to spread. So you could dig up little ones, but usually there's not just a few. You could consider selective herbicide, but one really, really opportune thing to do, not only if you're going to use herbicide, but also to add fertility to the soil, it helps the other things compete with it while you're hitting it hard with an herbicide. So those two things together can be incredibly successful. Mowing does not work. Buttercups. I'm probably gonna have to speed it up here because I still have a few I want to talk to you about and only have a few minutes left. Creeping buttercups. Here's one where it spreads by these little stolons and it makes lots of seed and it loves our clay-like conditions. There are other buttercups that we see in our fields. They'll be like tall buttercup, or sometimes called field buttercup. They don't spread by runners, it's primarily by seeds, but they all love the acidic soil that we have and they like it a little bit wet. They also have the defense mechanism of being incredibly bitter when you eat them. And so I don't eat them, but animals eat them. It burns their mouth. So this is keeping from being eaten. It lies really flat on the ground. So if you mow, it just continues to spread. It is really tough. And it's probably one of those that if you really don't want it and you have a lot of it, you're probably going to have to use a broadcast selective herbicide. However, again, you can always tolerate it if it's really not that detrimental to you, or you could maybe start to correct the underlying soil conditions. So I'm just going to speed through some of these. Himalayan blackberry. I mention these because I see more and more fields kind of going over to them. And this is not our native trailing blackberry. The big difference is big white flower and each petal kind of almost touches the next one. Our native ones are much narrower. You look at the leaves, once they're grown out, they're in 5 instead of 3, and they're rounded on the tips rather than triangular. And look at the stems. So they often spread by these berries or these giant canes that the tips will eventually touch the ground and they'll start a whole new plant. And it's quite a deep root ball. So the first time you see one, dig it out, get it gone. Goats, if you have an opportunity to have goats and can keep them in, they could be a great biocontrol because they like the taste of the leaves and they'll just keep hammering at them. But you can't just bring the goats in for a little bit and then send them back somewhere else. They need to be continually feeding till they wear out that system. You could, a great combo is mowing down those heavy infestations and then letting them come back up to about 18 inches and spraying them then. Then you're not doing a big spray, but there's some that just work amazingly well and you can get it gone and back into production pretty quickly. You could even cut stump for large canes. Mowing alone doesn't really do it because they seem to actually like it and they come back worse than they were before. Canada thistle. Everybody complains about Canada thistle with good reason, probably one of the hardest things to get rid of. And now you're starting to see that it's a creeping perennial. And there's actually a male and a female plant. And unless they're in close proximity, when they actually form up what look like seeds, there's nothing in them. They're actually infertile. Usually it's all clones. Here we have little clones from underground rhizomes that are growing along. They can grow 90 feet in 1 year. And they actually put out a chemical that inhibits grass. So it paves the way for itself to spread. So unlike bull thistle, the heads are very smooth and the stems are actually smooth as well. They're really not that pokey compared to a bull thistle where the whole stem is armored. So get at it early, don't let it go. And this is one, you could mow it at a minimum of 3 times per season and that will just suppress it. And you would have to do it pretty much forever because wherever they're connected to somewhere outside your fence, they're still providing sugars and impetus to grow farther into your field. Got to touch everybody that's connected. So often a selective herbicide really, really works well without touching a lot of the things that you do want. And never, ever, ever till ground that has had Canada thistle in it because now you are spreading all the little pieces, its reproductive pieces that are underground just waiting to come up and start a new plant. Horsetail, I'm just gonna end with this one as far as the plants because it is a native and it's here because it belongs here and it's the right conditions for it. And yes, it can be toxic if animals eat it in large quantities, but bracken ferns, same thing. I find it pretty weedy and I find it hard to believe it's native here, but it's one of those plants they call circumboreal, meaning it's everywhere on the planet. So it's native. Could you just tolerate it? Or could you have your animals fenced out of it to keep them away from it? It often indicates a place of moisture, so probably a little more sensitive ground in the first place, more prone to disturbance by hoof traffic. Bracken fern often says that this is really thin, rocky, marginal soil, probably not the best place to have your pasture in the first place. But if you're concerned about poisoning, consider mowing those heavy infestations. It'll be back, but you could get them down. Just things to know, it does not make flowers. This is the spore producing, and it comes up right now, early on, and these produce spores that blow around and find places to grow. And then this is the vegetative part. This dies back, and then you just see all this. So again, just like Canada thistle, tilling and renovation can spread it. There's very limited herbicide options. Nothing's permanent with this thing. It belongs here. It's not a flower one that has flowers. It's very, very ancient, and most of our herbicides aren't designed to work on its the way it works. So I'm just kind of quick review, because I know we're getting close to the end of time. I knew it'd be tight. So you need to set that goal of what you want to be in that pasture, and you got to be realistic. What do you have energy and resources and time to do? You need to know what weeds you've got, because if you don't know what they are, you can't figure out their life cycle. And if you can't figure out their life cycle, you can't interrupt it. You need to decide, can you tolerate it? This is a managed system. And so certainly it's not going to be perfect. It's an individual preference tailored to what you've got resources to throw at it. You've always got to correct those underlying conditions, or it's just going to happen over and over again. Herbicides are never a solution. They're really just treating a symptom. And you need to get at what's really drawing those things to you and how you can correct that for it to be sustainable. The sooner you can get at it, if you can prevent it or do something about it early, all your options are available to you, and it's always less expensive. And there's no single strategy that's going to work always, every time. Always it's going to be a combination, and you got to keep changing it up. The healthy plantings, like that healthy pasture, are going to resist those weeds. And this is more like if you're going to have native plants that you want. Native plants are adapted here. That's why horsetail does so well. And be clean in your materials and how you clean your equipment and how you dispose of things. If you're going to use chemical or fertilizers, use them carefully, use them sparingly, use them appropriately, ask for advice, and be persistent. Weeds are, and you will not win unless you are as well. So knowing your hay to keep your animals from being poisoned or spreading them into your beautiful pastures, know where they're often a source, because they're coming from somewhere else. Some weeds are tasty when they're dried in hay, and they can be dangerous. And livestock are more likely to eat those things when they have limited other things to eat. They're going to eat the tasty green things first. Know where it comes from. Know what the field looks like before you bring it in. So to prevent poisonings, you've got to identify and eliminate those sources. And always the perimeters are going to be where your new things are coming in. You can control your stuff, but it's hard to keep your neighbors from encroaching in that way. Make sure your animals have plenty to eat. Don't overgraze. We talked about those growing points and how they're very vulnerable, but how you can utilize that to your benefit. Be careful with herbicides and protect your animals in new surroundings so that they don't encounter something they're unfamiliar with and don't know to avoid. And check out where those animals are being kept. And a lot of ornamental plants are poisonous. So it's a lot of work. It's exhausting. No one said it was going to be easy, but that's part of the journey. And I think we could all be a happy family in our happy pasture when they're all clean of weeds. So again, fertility management is critical. Grazing management, light rotation, avoid that overgrazing, the trampling and disturbance. So I think that about wraps it up. And I'm going to stop there and give you a couple seconds to ask questions if you want to.
That was fantastic. This is Megan Adammeyer. Kathy, thank you so much for that presentation. It was really great. And I did actually have a question for you on horsetail. Are both forms as toxic, or do you know both the vegetative and the, I guess, I'm sorry, what did you call them?
The reproductive spore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would guess yes, but I would actually think there's not that much of it up. The spore producers, they're up for a few weeks and then they're gone.
Gotcha.
And so more likely the animal has something else to eat. I don't think they taste great. So I would imagine that it'd be more likely, it's about that exposure, right? More likely that they get a big enough dose of it later on vegetatively. But that's a great question. I'll ask around about that.
Okay, yeah. And we have found that people have had good success with horsetail that graze it later on in the season when it's much more coarse. The animals aren't going to be as likely to eat it, whereas when it's, pretty like new and kind of more succulent, it does seem like they hit it up when they're eating that grass around it. So,
And they can eat quite a lot before you're going to see those symptoms, like 20% of their, what they're eating. And that's a lot.
yeah.
So maybe just not let them go so far out towards the water, and that might limit how much they get exposed to. And then it's not an issue. So
Yeah.
that's how you can maybe deal with it, tolerate it to some degree, and avoid it too.
Definitely. Yeah. Maybe create a wetland in that little, planting or something in that area.
Right.
Yep. We've had landowners do that. It looks like we had a question come in, Kathy. Someone's biggest problem is clover. Can you address that a little bit? Any suggestions on that?
Well, I think I'd need to know why you didn't want that clover. Some clovers can be beneficial. Maybe tell me more about why you don't want it if they're typing away.
So far, it hasn't come in yet, but I will say that I have gone out to a lot of pastures and found that the white clover, the very low growing white clover, is what kind of takes over. And yes, she did say that the problem with clover is that it's kind of taking over their grass.
And is it, I'm going to guess maybe a horse, and often they don't want so much clover. It's just too rich.
Yes.
Yeah, that's my guess. That's my guess. So clover is successful because low growing points on that one. It's growing by stolons and it's below everything. And often animals don't graze it hard enough. I would say that because it's a nitrogen fixer, it also has another advantage, and it's fertilizing itself as it goes. You almost might consider, if it's really important to you, an herbicide treatment, and there are some that will work gangbusters on that and won't touch your grass. So that is an option if it's really important to you to keep the animals out of that much clover.
Just another idea as well for that is with clover, they don't like to be fertilized with nitrogen to a very high rate since they fix the clover. So if you get a soil test and you request specifically that you're growing grass pasture and don't put down that you have any legumes, which the clover is in the legume family, then they'll give you recommendations that will help your grass get healthier, but might actually start to get the clovers and alfalfa and other legumes out of your system. So that's one way you can.
That's a great trick. I like it. And unfortunately, there's the different kinds of clover. Some will need a little more moisture, but white clover actually can take dry really well. And so that's why it tends to be the one that you see persisting. That Dutch white clover. Yeah.
There was a question, Kathy, about the herbicide. Will basic weed and feed work
for
killing the clover?
Well, yes, the trouble with weed and feed is you're doing two different things. You're weeding and you're feeding, and they're actually very different activities. And fertilizer too much laid out there can get into water. That can be a problem where we're worried about water pollution or groundwater contamination. So it can be and needs to be watered in usually to do its work. If you can load it up enough, I suppose, but it's better if you're going to do those things, to do them separately. I'm more comfortable where you have the exact rate for the herbicide and you don't say, oh, I just want to fertilize a little more, and you throw out more. The herbicide in the weed and feed is a 2,4-D, and yes, it can work on clover. It may not be rugged enough for some of the clover you're dealing with, but certainly it could do some of that. I'm just very uncomfortable with weed and feed just because it's easy to overdo it and get the wrong rate. So you're probably better off separating those activities because they're almost done at different times better. And please don't hesitate to call me if you want to kind of brainstorm through your situation and you want to talk more about that stuff.
Great. That was a good answer, Kathy. I would say the same. If you can get a soil test and figure out what you actually need for your fertilizer needs, that's a great solution. And then, Kathy, any suggestions on where to look for herbicide in our county where someone can buy it locally? Do you suggest feed stores for pasture type?
Yeah. And again, I will just say, sometimes they have folks who are really knowledgeable. In some, they used to have a really great person down at the co-op, and he's gone, unfortunately. He was really, really knowledgeable, and I don't really know that they know as much about how to really deploy it to the best effect. But the co-op and coastal has a lot, and I think Leeds has quite a few. So yes, that the advantage of doing it locally is that you maybe have somebody who can help you choose something or explain what you're doing. Probably better, unless you're really knowledgeable and you know what you're looking for and you know what you're after, versus getting it at Home Depot or someplace else where there's no one there to help you choose it out or interpret the label, what they're trying to tell you, but you didn't know they were trying to tell you that. So again, Megan, it's probably a class we ought to try and do, is just to help people read those labels so that they can figure some of those things out. Online, again, a little tricky. And so there's some really good swim places, and Leeds is probably, maybe well, I don't know, the airport nursery. What do you think? Does that have them? I don't think so.
You know, I haven't been in there for a while, so I'm not sure if they do or not. I know they have some fertilizers and things. They probably do have some herbicides, but it might be more tailored to gardens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Squim probably has the most options, and Coastal carries quite a few things. And the co-op does too. And I was really impressed with some of the signage that they had. The last, it was a couple of years ago, that I like to peruse and check it out. And Leeds had quite a selection when they were in Port Angeles. I was sorry to see them move out of town, but if it's really helpful not only to get them, but to get the information that you need to go with them. And again, I love to walk through people through those things so that they're better informed and can do the right thing.
For sure. And we're getting support for a class, Kathy, on herbicide labels. So
scary, but it's really cool. And there's just so much in those labels. They're just packed, and it's like, what are they trying to tell me? So yeah.
Well, even if we, scheduled just a 15-minute or half hour, something, I don't know how much time you need, but we would be happy to facilitate something like that. So let's talk about that, Kathy, and see what we could come up with to help folks.
We're going to do it that before COVID hit. Remember, we were working that out with Coastal, remember?
Yep. We had a whole series planned for last spring, and then COVID hit. So yeah, fingers crossed we'll be able to actually get out and do something like that again in the near future. So it looks like that's the end of the questions, Kathy. Thank you so much for doing this presentation for us. And again, folks, I'll email the recording out to all of you on here, so you'll have it if you wanted to refer to it again, or to send folks along that might benefit from this as well. So that concludes our April Horse and Livestock series. But like Kathy said, she's a wealth of information and
I didn't say that, but I said,
well, you didn't say that part, but I'm saying that part because we call her up all the time, send weed photos to her for identification. So you have her information here, and she's always happy to get back with an answer. And I don't think I've ever contacted you, Kathy, that you have left me without one. You always know the answer.
Thank you, but I love to do it. So don't hesitate ever.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.